Welcome, everyone, to this evening's discussion of family violence and child welfare, featuring two distinguished speakers, Judge Erika Tindill and Tawanna Brown. Pardon me while I just admit a few more people to this meeting. So we're going to try to keep this to an hour, so I will make the introductions brief, though particularly in the case of Judge Tindill, we could read her extensive bio probably for a couple of minutes. But for these purposes, we're going to focus on what she did prior to her appointment to the bench. So she was executive director of the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence, has also led legal assistance here in New Haven, has been on the board of the Rape Crisis Center of Milford, and was with me and others on the board years ago of Domestic Violence Services of Greater New Haven before it became what is now known as the Umbrella Center for Domestic Violence Services under BH Care. Some of you may know of that organization. In addition, she served as a prosecutor of domestic violence cases in Florida earlier in her career, and she teaches law at Quinnipiac. So we will have her speak momentarily, but let me also introduce Tawanna Brown, who is, some of you know from last week. She had a really excellent presentation that will be available on our YouTube channel in the days ahead. And tonight she will be with Judge Tindill discussing her experience in New Jersey growing up. She has significant experience, she and her family, and she's also become a really powerful national young spokesperson for issues of family violence, the foster care system, youth leadership and advocacy in New Jersey and elsewhere. And she, as some of you heard me say last week, graduated college in just 3 years and has become again, a really remarkable young voice for these important issues. So we're pleased to have both of them with us tonight.
Thank you.
And I think the plan, and we're going to be flexible with this, but the plan is for Tawanna to begin, but also for Judge Tindill to speak for a significant period, and then for us to welcome questions and discussion at any point. This is meant to be informal, and we're really glad to have you all with us tonight. So, Tawanna, why don't you begin?
Thank you. Thank you for having me once again to be able to talk about such an important and needed conversation and topic. So when it comes to domestic violence, it looks very different in every family. So sometimes people are trying to define it in one particular way. However, domestic violence is not always just physical. It could be emotional, mental, verbal, and sexual. And from my experience, as someone who is not a victim of domestic violence, but a survivor of domestic violence, I've experienced all forms of it. And what I came to learn as I got older is that it was also a financial piece that as a kid, I didn't really understand why my mother, right, would stay or the things that kept her in that situation. But I realized as I gotten older that it was bigger than me. It was bigger than my siblings. And it was an example of generational cycles that continue to perpetuate itself within my family and our family circumstances. So how I ended up within the child welfare system, the foster care system, was because of numerous reports of domestic violence. However, domestic violence is not always looked at or criminalized. It's handled through the family route, family reunification, ways to keep families together to see if those issues could be resolved. However, in my instance with my family, it was not an issue where reunification was an option. So because of that, at the age of 11, myself and my four siblings entered the child welfare system. And that's how we then transitioned into kinship care, foster placements, adoption, and I experienced failed adoption. So I recently aged out of the child welfare system a year and a half ago. So that's just a little bit of the background for me. So Josiah, I don't know if you have another question, or Judge Tindill, if you want to jump in.
Sure. Thank you, Tawanna. So thank you very much for having me, and thank you, Josiah, for that lovely introduction. I want to um, just express how important it is to have voices like Tawanna Brown as activists and advocates for this area. I've worked in the domestic violence field for more than 20 years, probably closer to 3 decades now, and it is a little disheartening sometimes that we keep having the same conversations, but it is because systems are limited to rules, such as, for example, reunification, right? When someone reaches out to governmental systems for help, systems are limited to rules. For example, there's a requirement that there be reunification, for example, of families, because that's what the law is. So as a judge and as a prosecutor, my job is to make sure that, I'm following the rules. But often those rules and those policies are designed by people who are not the people who are closest to the problem. And we're also not asking the people who are closest to the problem about how to solve those problems. I started off as a prosecutor early in my legal career, specializing in domestic violence, and I can second what Tawanna is saying about, I think many people often think of domestic violence as physical violence between husband and wife or boyfriend and girlfriend or same-sex couples. And it is so much broader than that, so much more than that. Um, it is about uh, when I say domestic violence, it's about a pattern and practice of controlling um, an intimate partner, everything about what they do, their social activities, how they dress, their schedule, whether they work, their spending and shopping habits, who they have contact with, such that they are continually isolated from people who can um, talk to them and evaluate their experiences in a way that they may not see it. So the person who is the victim of this type of abuse, whether it be coercive control or physical, loses all agency and becomes 100% dependent in some way on the abuser, who ironically is often also very much dependent on the person that they are abusing. One of the things, Tawana, that you said struck me is that often the people I would work with and that I see now, they're mostly women. It's not always women, but they rarely identify as victims. Rarely. We use the word victims, but many, many women or men who are receiving this sort of abuse rarely refer to themselves as domestic violence victims. And when they do speak out, they have survived the abuse, and so they identify more readily with being a survivor. The other thing I want to point out about uh, domestic violence, besides it's not just physical and encompasses all of the areas that Tawana spoke about, is that often we ask, why doesn't she just leave? Why would she be physically hurt in this way, or her children hurt, or be financially controlled, or not allowed to leave the house, or be required to dress a certain way? Why wouldn't that person, that victim, simply leave? And I just want to impress upon people that they do over and over and over again. Um, One of the most famous cases, maybe you haven't heard of it, there was a woman named Tracy Thurman, and she sued. She was the first woman in the United States to sue, maybe in the world, to sue a municipality and a police department for their failure to protect her. So in the early 1980s, she had left her very physically and emotionally abusive husband, took their young son, and moved from Florida to Connecticut, and he followed her. And she called the police repeatedly. Her landlord was involved. She went down physically to the police station, and he continued to show up and threaten her, threatened to kill her, threatened to take their child. Took the child, came while a police officer watched, stabbed her, chased her around, and it resulted in a federal lawsuit. Um, and she won. She was awarded $2.3 million. I think it settled for less because the police department agreed not to appeal the decision. But I don't want you to leave this hour without understanding that survivors of violence leave over and over again. And many, many times, what they learn by leaving is that their abuser is simply going to find them, and it gets worse. I'll leave it at that because I could keep going, but we want to hear from others and also Tawanna.
Thank you for sharing that. And something that struck me and something that stuck out is the point that you made that over and time again that survivors do typically leave. And that was the case with my family. Like, I vividly remember instances where we were packing up all our things and we thought that we were leaving for good. And whether it was us sleeping in the park for one night or weeks on end and then still being found and going back into that same situation. So it was one of those things where it kind of became like the normal for us. And an instance for my family was my father was very good at, after severely abusing all of us, like taking us and buying us all different things. So as a kid, this was confusing because I thought this is what love was, right? Like, it's supposed to hurt. It might be painful, but then you'll get rewarded at the end of the week. So that way you don't go to school and you don't say anything to anybody. So these were things that I had to learn how to unlearn as I've gotten older. And it's still a lot of things that some are easier to unpack than others. But I do want to point that out, that a lot of times I often hear that even in spaces that I take up now, and I make it a point. A local organization that's close to me is Support Sophia, which is a nonprofit domestic violence organization, which I volunteer with every year, whether it's writing handwritten letters to survivors, whether it's dropping off clothes, whatever that may look like. That's my way of giving back to that community. Is oftentimes when I'm talking to different people, whether it's at a walk or an event, we often hear, well, why didn't they just leave? Or that is the conversation starter. And I think sometimes we have to redirect that, right? Like, why is it hard for them to leave? What are the barriers and what those gaps look like?
But not only that, it's so interesting to me as I did this work, and I'm not a survivor of violence in my home or intimate partner violence, but it's always fascinating to me as over the years that we often focus on what the victim is doing or not doing, saying or not saying, accessing services or not accessing. We focus on the victim. And I'm not sure. I know why. I have my own ideas about why we don't say, why does he hit her? Why does she, control all of the money? Why is he emotionally abusive? We're not asking those questions. We're asking questions about, we're putting the responsibility on the person who is suffering the abuse to fix it. And so I do want to encourage you in your thinking as you're working with children, as you're volunteering in juvenile courts representing neglected children, or as you talk to your neighbors and friends, and the issue of domestic violence comes up. I want you to think about that perspective when you start to ask questions about what the victim is doing or failing to do, why it is that you're not asking, why we're focusing on the victim and not the perpetrator. That's an important shift for this conversation.
And I will just add, we had discussed before this meeting a resource that Judge Tindill and I were familiar with here in Connecticut, but it's also of national scope, called Fathers for Change. And it's an initiative led by Dr. Carla Stover, who's at the Yale Child Study Center. We're planning to present her speaking about that program early in the new year, so look out for that. And in addition, this is, as was said, Domestic Violence Awareness Month, October, but this is such an acute problem year round, and we want to be sure that you all are aware of resources such as CT Safe Connect, to which you can refer uh, families, including children as needed. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. And I would like to invite Judge Tindill, Tawanna, Chris Tanasi, or others in the audience who have seen uh, this cluster of problems from different angles, perhaps including the law enforcement angle, the role of DCF and the courts. And then also, I'm thinking, Judge Tindill or Erika, that when you were at the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence, working with providers all over the state, you saw somewhat different approaches in the more rural versus the more urban communities. This is all over. There has been some progress, I think, in terms of providing victim advocates that are paid, as opposed, certainly our volunteer advocates play a very important role, but it's also important in this case to have paid victim advocates for the survivors of family violence. So I will be quiet and invite any of the three of you or anyone else to speak up about these or other topics.
I do want to mention, I started to tell you about Thurman versus the city of Torrington. What I didn't say was that that case, the result of that case, which is from 1986, is, well, I think the case settled earlier than 1986. Let's say 1985. 1986, Connecticut passed the Family Violence Prevention and Response Act. And as a direct result of that lawsuit, and of course that spread to domestic violence reforms, this particular federal lawsuit spread to other states, but Connecticut in 1986 was the first to have this comprehensive response to victims of domestic violence. And in Connecticut, we have family violence laws. That's a family violence law. One of the most important things, there are lots of things that came out of it, was that as a result, the police were required to make an arrest in a domestic violence situation, required, whether or not the victim, the person who was being abused, wanted to press charges or not. And that was a huge leap. Of course, there are problems, as you can imagine, because now sometimes law enforcement shows up and everybody's getting arrested, right? So I spent some of my time as a defense attorney defending mostly women who had been scooped up in this arrest, right? So that also encourages the victim not to call, right? Because the police say, well, listen, if we come out there, somebody's getting arrested, so work it out. So it wasn't that it was the solution, but at a minimum, and I mean, if you read about what happened in Tracy Thurman's case, you'll understand why that was one of the first things that came out of that the police had to make an arrest. They were unwilling and basically refused over and over again, even though they were actually witnessing threats and assaults by Buck Thurman. They refused to arrest him initially. In 1994, a federal law, the Violence Against Women Act, was signed into law by President Clinton, and that was the first federal legislation that required sexual assault and domestic violence were classified as crimes, and there were lots of things that flowed from that, from implications to Second Amendment. You can't have a gun if you are convicted. So lots of things came from that, and that's a federal law that gets renewed every 5 years and gets expanded to things like there was grant money for legal assistance for victims of domestic violence. So as a legal aid attorney, I was paid to defend victims of domestic violence in criminal court, file lawsuits on their behalf in civil court, and all of that got funded through a VOWR grant. So there, on the legal side, there have been efforts made to try to address the problem. In more recent years, there have been efforts to focus more resources on prevention as opposed to solely intervention. I want to say that both are clearly important, but it's sort of like coming up with funding to stand at the bottom of the river to snatch people out who are drowning without going to the head to figure out why people are falling in or why they're being pushed in. So there has been in sort of the domestic violence movement more of an effort, certainly in recent years, around preventing it from even happening, to catch the Tawanna Browns when they're fifth graders and third graders figuring out how to to manage this trauma and this abuse. But again, you can't take the Tawanna Browns and her siblings and fix them and then send them back to a mother who's still experiencing the same thing and not offer some supports or some engagement for her. So prevention is needs to be thoughtful and well planned, and also needs to be driven by the survivors themselves. What survivors want is for the abuse to stop. That's what they want. They don't always necessarily want him to go to jail forever, or that person to be deported, or that, and it sounds crazy to those of us that are thinking, you know, if you're hitting me regularly or controlling me, I want you under somebody's prison. But we have to listen to the people who are experiencing it if we're going to do what they know is best for them and their families. The survivors know how to manage the abuse. What they often need when they try to extract themselves from the relationship is support and services and places. Because as Tawanna said, you know, she and her siblings and her mother were sleeping in a park. So that's not real incentive, you know, in New Jersey in the dead of winter to be, you know, where's she going to go? What's she going to do? So I say all of that just to say that our resources must go to both ends, to both prevention and intervention, but certainly, in my personal opinion, much more resources need to be devoted to preventing the abuse at all, dealing with trauma, but also we need to be able to work effectively with the perpetrators. We need to include men in the solution. And again, this is my own personal opinion. This is not sort of condoned by, you know, any domestic violence agency or the Connecticut Judicial Branch. But in my work with domestic violence agencies, often there were advocates who refused to work with men, who refused to work with perpetrators. And personally, if there's some reason why you're triggered by working with perpetrators, that makes sense. But as a system, we have to include perpetrators in the solution, in my own personal opinion, because we didn't come out of the womb abusing others. There's a reason why we got there. The number one risk factor for being either a perpetrator or a victim is that you witnessed it as a child. Number one factor. So.
Thank you.